Hello, and welcome to the second episode of More News from Nowhere, where we're going to be jumping into the second chapter of Peter Kropotkin's The Conquest of Bread. So, last chapter, he basically started with a unique argument about the abolition of private property. And so here in chapter 2, he's going to kind of make a proactive defense against those who might claim that there's not enough resources to maintain what he calls well-being for all. So, his first point is that development has outstripped population growth, and that in fact, we already supply resources to a large population that does not themselves produce anything, which is kind of the modern world, that's how it functions. Secondly, he addresses the deliberate underproduction and waste that are a natural part of capitalist markets. Quote, "Nor is this all. Those who withhold capital constantly reduce the output by restraining production. We need not speak of the cartloads of oysters thrown into the sea to prevent a dainty hitherto reserved for the rich from becoming a food for the people." End quote. Next, he describes the fact that we all instinctively understand that when the market dictates production, we waste immense resources and productive power on useless objects that have little or nothing to do with human well-being. In fact, much of our productive power and monetary resources are squandered on a military whose primary purpose is to expand capitalist markets. Quote, "It is impossible to reckon in figures the extent to which wealth is restricted indirectly, the extent to which energy is squandered that might have served to produce and above all to prepare the machinery necessary to production. It's enough to cite the immense sums spent by Europe in armaments for the sole purpose of acquiring control of the markets, and so forcing our own commercial standards on the neighboring territories and making exploitation easier at home. The millions paid every year to officials of all sorts whose function it is to maintain the rights of minorities, the right, that is, of a few rich men, to manipulate the economic activity of the nation. The millions spent on judges, prisons, policemen, and all the paraphernalia of so-called justice spent to no purpose, because we know that every alleviation, however slight, of the wretchedness of our great cities is followed by a very considerable diminution of crime. Lastly, the millions spent on propagating pernicious doctrines by means of the press, the news cooked in the interest of this or that party, of this politician, or of that company of exploiters." End quote. So, summing up his arguments for the productive abilities for a socialist society, he says, quote, "Thus, if we consider, on the one hand, the rapidity with which civilized nations augment their powers of production, and on the other hand, the limits set to that production, be it directly or indirectly, by existing conditions, one cannot but conclude that the economic system a trifle more enlightened would permit them to heap up in a few years so many useful products that they would be constrained to cry, 'Enough! We have enough coal and bread and raiment. Let us rest and consider how best to use our powers, how best to employ our leisure.'" End quote. So Kropotkin ends part 1 of chapter 2 by naming the method of creating the well-being for all, expropriation of capital. So he begins the discussion of how to redistribute resources by roundly rejecting any kind of reformist or legislative action. Instead, he calls for the, quote, "necessity of a social revolution," end quote. The remainder of section 2 is essentially a criticism of previous attempts at revolution, claiming that we tend to be far more interested in the theater of revolution than the nuts and bolts issues of what to do once the ruling class is dead or run out of town. He is, not surprisingly, highly critical of any so-called revolutionary government, which tends to become an infighting group of self-proclaimed representatives that fiddle while the people suffer. So, how to avoid this reactionary middle-class provisional government and assure the implementation of a socialist organization? Part 3 sets out to answer that question. The first thing is to abandon all reformist nonsense, such as calling for a right to work, etc. Instead, the socialist revolution must take as its beginning point a right to live. Quote, "For the first time in history, a revolution has been accomplished which considers the needs of the people before schooling them in their duties. This cannot be brought about by acts of parliament, but only by taking immediate and effective possession of all that is necessary to ensure the well-being of all. This is the only really scientific way of going to work, the only way to be understood and desired by the mass of the people. We must take possession in the name of the people, of the granaries, of the shops full of clothing, of the dwelling houses. Nothing must be wasted. We must organize without delay to feed the hungry, to satisfy all wants, to meet all needs, to produce, not for the special benefit of this one or that one, but to ensure the society as a whole will live and grow." End quote. And that finishes up chapter 2. So, shifting over into the analysis, Kropotkin begins by saying that the socialist revolution is not a revolution of the people, but a revolution of the the first thing I think is that the majority of this chapter reads like a takedown of Lenin, even though it predates most of the writings of Lenin. As Lenin describes the necessity of a vanguard party to carry out the will of the revolutionary masses, Kropotkin rejects such a formulation out of hand. Lenin would describe this as an infantile disease that doesn't account for a scientific understanding of history. So, how does this formulation stand up to the Leninist critique? So far, I'm going to say not real well. While Kropotkin points out all the dangers of a revolutionary party, reactionism, concessions to the bourgeoisie, infighting, etc., he doesn't, at least in this chapter, lay out any kind of program for creating an anarchist socialism. In that last quote, he says that we must organize to distribute these resources, but hasn't really given us any indication about how that organization takes place without any kind of centralized government, without a state. So far, what we really have is just an assertion of first principles, the right to life and the right to well-being, that he claims will lead us toward genuine revolution. So here's to hoping that Chapter 3 outlines this process, because right now it's just kind of sitting there. My biggest takeaway is how much Kropotkin has internalized a Marxist view of history. Capitalist industrialization really is the necessary precondition for socialist revolution. Capitalism has marshaled all these productive forces, and now socialism will employ them for all. It's also remarkable how modern his descriptions of capitalist production and underproduction and just kind of bonkers production feels. Like not much has really changed in more than 100 years. And his descriptions of the resources that industrialization have put at our fingertips is really important. It's what Bookchin would call post-scarcity anarchism. And it's still a pretty solid response to any kind of Malthusian nonsense, if somebody from the 19th century came back from the dead to argue with you. Or, in the modern formation, the reactionary, why should we take care of those people when we can't even take care of our own? The answer is that we can take care of everyone. If we were to simply stop allowing a handful of psychopaths to dictate how those productive powers are being employed. So, again, not a lot of answers in Chapter 2, but a fairly coherent argument, at least coming together at this point. So please join me next time for Chapter 3, and we'll see if Kropotkin gives us any more details for his anarchist revolution. If you check the comments below, you will see a link to the text that I'm reading from, as well as a link to visit us on Facebook. All right, see you next time.